Okay, next up we have Chris Bosselman from the Department of Health here to present on the checklist manifesto today.
Thank you, Stacy. It's really a pleasure to be invited to speak here, and when Stacy extended this invitation to me, she said that I was supposed to be a motivational speaker. I just laughed at that. I thought that was hilarious. So I told her that I'm not a motivational speaker, but I had read this really cool book recently and I could talk about that. And she agreed. And so my goal today is that if you feel motivated to incorporate checklists in any part of your life, then Stacy will be happy and will have succeeded. So the book, and the program comes up. The book is the Checklist Manifesto, and it's written by Atul Gawande, and I appreciate the plug from Anne about this author. He's a surgeon, but really a pretty interesting guy and a very excellent author, and I found the book extremely easy to read. Just a little bit about Gawande. A surgeon, but also a pretty influential author. He has written another book that's on the New York Times bestseller list, which I have yet to read, but Anne can tell you all about it. He practices general and endocrine surgery at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. Has anyone here heard about the new healthcare venture that's a combination of efforts between Berkshire Hathaway, Amazon, and J.P. Morgan Chase? Yeah. Not a lot of press about that, but when I heard about it, I thought, this is really interesting. You have a major investment company, you have online shopping, and one of the biggest banks, and they're going to combine to form a healthcare organization. I don't know much about it, but anyway, this guy, Atul Gawande, has been identified as the CEO of that event. So interesting things are going to happen. He also writes for the New Yorker magazine, and again, he wrote this other book, which I'm excited to read, Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. So in this book that I'm presenting to you, what he does is he builds a case for using checklists. And that case is presented in a couple of different industries, which I'll go through as briefly as I can. And then he talks about his own experience with checklists, how he used it. Would you like me to stand in one place? You're fine. Okay. We'll keep you from falling asleep. Talks about his own experience with checklists and how they where they came from, how they're implemented, and some of the benefits of using them. And then he concludes the book with an example of how a checklist that he used was very much a life-saving, couple of examples of life-saving implementations of checklists. Okay, so the problem of extreme complexity. You can see in this picture behind, it's a little faded, but you've got a team in an emergency room. I think I counted 11 people in this picture. Each of them have a specialty. And they're all doing their specialized, focused work to save the life of this person that's on the gurney. There are advances in medicine that are happening so rapidly that a generalist is really hard-pressed to keep up with everything that's going on. There's so much information that's coming out as medicine advances that you can't really keep track of all of it. So to deal with that, people are becoming more narrowly specialized. And the author began as a general surgeon, and over the years has become more increasingly specialized, and now his specialization is removing tumors from endocrine glands. That's pretty narrow. But he feels that he had to do that in order to be at the top of the game in that particular thing. If you're too broad, then you just can't keep up and you fall behind. Too much information in the field generally for one person to comprehend and manage. I don't know if that's necessarily as applicable in HR when I think about the advancement of like employment law. That proceeds at a fairly measured or perhaps a slow pace. When I think about maybe things where HR is really taking off, I think about recruitment, the explosion of online job posting services and how we search for jobs, how we search for candidates, how we interact in that way. And if we had more time, I'd like to have a discussion with you folks about how you see HR and if you feel pressed as this surgeon did and as far as keeping up with developments. Training might be another example where things are progressing. We're moving from stand-up presentations like this to more interactive and online and shorter, more defined, focused training efforts. Anyway, the idea is that in our life, it's becoming more and more complex. The problem then is that simple and critical things get overlooked because the pace is occurring so fast. So in medicine, we have medical errors that are at unacceptable rates, and we have nosocomial infections that are at unacceptable levels. I had to look that word up too. Nosocomial means an infection that you get because you went to the hospital. I went in for an operation or for a procedure. I come back with a staph infection because I achieved that at the hospital. So how do we deal with all of this change and complexity? And the know-how has become unmanageable. So in medicine, because of the pace of change, we have to have some way of controlling, and even though you're an expert in your area, very often simple things get overlooked. For example, if the pace is so fast that you're going from patient to patient to patient, you may overlook something as simple as just washing your hands between patients, and so infections are passed from one person to another. Okay, another case for checklist. This is World War II, and we have the Army Air Force who has submitted a proposal for a new bomber. Douglas, Martin, and Boeing all responded to this proposal. Boeing trounced both Douglas and Martin in the bidding process, and the way that they did that is they developed a bomber that far exceeded the Army Air Force's specifications. It could fly farther, it could carry more payload, it had better weaponry, it had better navigation. It was just a superior plane all the way around. So the Army Air Force was really excited about using this plane. On its demo flight, this plane took off, climbed to about 300 feet, and I don't know if it turned over or it nosedived, but it crashed into the ground, killing the pilot and another crew member. The reason for this is because the pilot forgot to unlock a simple mechanism that controlled some of the control surfaces. Just simply overlooked it. Now, this particular plane was more complex than any previous bomber that had been built. Instead of 2 engines, it had 4, something new called variable pitch propellers. It was just more advanced, but it was also more complex. They deemed this plane as more than one man can fly. The Army Air Force really wanted this plane, and so they got a group of pilots, experienced pilots together, and they said, what can we do so that a pilot can actually navigate this plane? And so these pilots got together and conferred, and what they came up with were 4 simple checklists. A pre-flight checklist, a checklist for takeoff, a checklist for landing, and then one for taxiing. Each of these checklists were small enough to fit on a 3x5 card. So this was the birth of checklist, essentially, and this bomber that Boeing proposed. They proposed it as the 299 bomber. The Army Air Force renamed it as the B-17, if you've recognized the image. And it became a significant advantage that helped us win World War II. Thousands of them made, and they were a tremendous weapon in the war. All right, so another industry where complexity has overcome, and that is that of the construction industry. This is a cathedral in Europe. You guys probably recognize this as Notre Dame. Many European cathedrals were built under the guidance of a master builder. Do we have any Ken Follett fans here? Okay, who has read The Pillars of the Earth? Yeah, all right. Pretty fascinating book. If you're looking for an interesting read, I'd recommend that as well. It's all about building cathedrals in Europe in sort of medieval times. And the book, I don't know, it's about 1,000 pages. It's quite a long book. It all revolves around the master builder or several master builders. I can save you 1,000 pages of reading and say, yes, they built a cathedral. But anyway, so many of these cathedrals were built under the guidance of a master builder, and the master builder then was responsible for the design of the building, the materials used, the sequence of all of the activities from start to finish, what steps in the construction process. They provided guidance to the stonemasons and the woodworkers and everyone else, but it was all one guy that did it. As buildings progressed, once again, complexity became too great for one person to manage. So they had to figure out a way to address this increasing complexity. Construction today requires the coordination of many teams of specialists. When you think about just in your own home, you have all of these systems that interact to provide a residence for you. You have your foundation, you have your structure, you have your roofing, you've got plumbing, you have electrical, you have heating, ventilation, air conditioning, sound systems, all of that, and they're not separate and distinct because they're all integrated inside this same building. When we have a building like this, it's even more complex and more difficult to build. The last U.S. building, according to our author, that was probably built under the guidance of the master builder was likely to be the U.S. Capitol building, started in 1793 and completed in 1800. So, the author recognized that there was an addition being built to his hospital in Massachusetts. And he's a very curious person, and so he went and he talked to the contracting company that was the general for this construction project. And the contractor gave him a tour through this building, beginning at the bottom floor and then going up to the top, and then again at the top going down to the bottom. And what he observed was that the construction at the bottom was more complete because you build a building from the ground up, obviously. So the first floor was almost finished, and the top floor was really just steel and concrete, and then various levels of completion in between. So beginning at the top floor and coming down, you can see kind of a sequential process for the construction. Again, these various systems that are all combined together to make a building like this function. When he got to the office of the construction company, he saw on the wall what was called an integrated or a master schedule. And he recognized that this master schedule was in fact just an integrated checklist combining all of the steps in the construction process from all of the various teams or specialties in one single list. Very, very complex, very long. So again, a checklist is being used to handle the complexity or the extreme complexity in this particular process. On the opposite wall of the office, he saw what is called a submittal schedule. And the submittal schedule works in combination with the master schedule, but it focuses on communication tasks. So this submittal schedule ensures that critical items are discussed between the respective teams at the proper time and in the proper sequence. So when you think about, if you can envision constructing a building like this, the electricians have to work with the ventilation guys, have to work with the plumbers, have to work with the finishers, have to work with the structural guys, and all of these puzzle pieces fit together to create a building like this, but the sequence is very important. And so the combination of the master schedule and the submittal schedule ensures that both actions and discussions occur in the correct sequence. All right, so now I'd like you to think about the processes that you operate or you are responsible for in your respective jobs. Are there some that are multidisciplined, where you have interactions with other team members? Are there processes where the sequence is important? Typically, we see a workflow, for example, PMI, we're right in the middle of that right now. There's a very specific sequence that evaluation form goes through. You might have similar processes where you work. Do any of those processes get overlooked at times? Are any of the steps critical? So if the answer to any of these questions is yes, then this may be a candidate to have a checklist. I'm a trainer primarily by profession, and so I deliver a lot of classes, and for each major class, some of them are 2 days, some of them are longer, but I have a checklist that I go through to make sure that I have everything in place, materials, presentation, the clicker, all of that stuff that's necessary. All right, so these submittal schedule and the master schedule, they enable unforeseen problems to be resolved with mutual agreement through these communication activities in the proper sequence. So here's the big idea that Gawande got from his research with the construction process. When we're confronted with problems that are complex, non-routine, unanticipated, or potentially dangerous, how do we resolve those problems? The answer was we push the decision-making authority away from the center to the periphery. So it's not the general supervisor, construction supervisor, that makes the decisions. If there's a conflict between the electricians and the plumbers and the finishers, they push the decision-making authority to those guys because they're the ones that recognize the problem. They're the ones that are actually doing the work, and they're the ones that know best how to make it work for all of the parties involved. Here's an example from history. The photo here is Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, almost 15 years ago. And monster hurricane came in, some of the levees broke, flooded a large portion of New Orleans. In this situation, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, came in and they took control of the whole situation. Because of the extreme complexity and the dynamics of this particular storm, there were food, water, and supplies that had been gathered and delivered from across the nation that stood waiting while people suffered. There were school buses that stood empty while people needed evacuation out of New Orleans. People waited on rooftops for evacuation while boats sat unused. So FEMA could have done a much better job if they had pushed some of that decision-making authority out to the people that were actually doing the work. Because those people saw the need, they knew what was immediate and what could wait, they knew where some of the resources were, They didn't have the whole picture, but they were so much closer to the problem that they had a much better chance of making it work. So again, the extreme complexity was not managed well and more or less stifled. Okay, so lessons learned in this situation. Teamwork is essential. Again, I'd ask the question for you, where is teamwork involved in your particular job? Who do you interact with? Who else needs to know? And who else needs to be involved? And at what point in the process do they need to be informed or consulted or communicated with when you're making decisions and when the process is marching along? In the operating room, the author, Atul Gawande, observed, just by his personal observation and also with interviews of nurses and support staff and surgeons, that there was not a tremendous sense of teamwork in the operating room. Specifically, the nurses felt slighted because they saw themselves as having a huge role to contribute in the success of an operation. The surgeons typically had a pretty strong ego and a very dominant sense of control. They were in charge and didn't necessarily give the nurses the respect or the, I guess respect would probably be the right word, that they felt that they needed. So when Gawande put his first checklist together, he added a step in the checklist where people in the operating room, before the patient was brought in, everyone in the team, the operating room, would introduce themselves by their name and by their function. The nurses loved it. The doctors were annoyed by it. They saw that as a waste of time. But what he found is after the implementation of this additional step in the checklist, then the team became more cohesive. There was more communication. There was more respect, and the outcomes of the operations were better. All right, so he continues his research into checklists, and he found a guy by the name of Daniel Boorman. Daniel Boorman spent 20 years developing checklists for Boeing. So again, checklists were born in the aviation industry. Boeing is one of the major aircraft manufacturers in the world, and so they became experts at creating checklists. And so Gawande went to Boorman and tried to learn about the anatomy, essentially the anatomy of a checklist. He discovered that there were two basic types. There's the read-do checklist, which you're all familiar with if you've ever seen a cookbook. This is how recipes are. Take 4 cups of flour, boom. Add a teaspoon of salt, boom. 2 cups of oil, boom. You just read them off and you go through and you follow what the checklist says to do. The second type of checklist is a do-confirm checklist. So this is a situation where you're pretty much operating from memory. You don't need to be told what to do, but you want to make sure that you've done everything in the process and not forgotten anything. So at some point, you stop and you review the checklist, and everyone that's on the team says, yep, I've done that, yep, I've done that, yep, I've done that. Oh, wait a minute, I didn't do that. And you can go back and you can recover and put in that step before you get too far down the process. Boorman recommends pause points in the do-confirm checklist to give everyone an opportunity to, in fact, confirm that they have fulfilled their responsibility. So you can imagine in an operating room, when you're operating on a person, at some point you need to make sure that you've counted the sponges and the needles and everything that went into the patient has now come out of the patient and has been accounted for before you close the incision. So those pause points are very essential. He recommends usually 5 to 9 items on a checklist between pause points. More than that, it's hard to remember back what you've done, or maybe the process has gone too far, makes recovery more difficult. And he recommends focusing on the killer items. So your checklist doesn't necessarily need to be 250 items long, but just those points, those steps in the process that would cause a disaster if they were overlooked. And then finally, the wording should be simple and exact, something that everyone could understand. And if you actually have a written checklist, there are some recommendations on the kind of typeface and that sort of thing. That's included in your handout, by the way. All right, so the test. This is part of the process of the presentation where I could not figure out a way to get it onto a PowerPoint slide. So the World Health Organization invited Gawande to provide his knowledge and assistance to help them solve what they saw as increasing surgical errors in hospitals around the world. And they gave him a list of hospitals that were being observed by the World Health Organization, quite a long list, and through communications they identified 8 hospitals that were willing to participate in a test. These hospitals, I think there were 2 in the United States. One was a large metropolitan hospital, another one was a small rural hospital, one in Indonesia, one in rural Africa, I think, and South America. So in those 8 hospitals, a tremendous diversity of technical skill, of finances, of condition of equipment, patient loads, the building, the facility itself, just a huge diversity in hospitals. What Gawande did was he organized teams, and he sent a team of individuals to each hospital to assess the situation. And when they came back and reported, he was really astounded and daunted by the extreme variety of the surgical processes that occurred in each of these 8 hospitals. Then he sent the observers back to these 8 hospitals and asked them to do nothing for 3 months but to record outcomes. So they documented how many infections occurred, how many deaths, how many complications from these surgeries, how many people returned after the operation for long-term complications. And they did that for 3 months. They discovered that there were there was a lot of commonality in some of the errors. So infection control was a common problem that everyone dealt with. I mentioned sponge counts, needle counts, things of that nature. So they came up with a list of, even considering the diversity of these hospitals, they still had a lot of common issues that they had to deal with. With that information, Gawande then created a trial checklist that he was ready to present to these hospitals to encourage them to use. They were not mandatory, but I think he was very clever in this situation, because what he did is before he introduced the checklist, he shared the data that these observation teams had collected for 3 months with the surgeons and the hospital administrators. And they were very disturbed by the data that they read about their particular hospital. So in that action, he created the need. He heightened their sense of concern about their performance. And then he introduced the checklist. It was not mandatory. He expected a lot of pushback from surgeons because, as a surgeon himself, he recognized how much pressure they feel when they've got a patient who's in an emergency situation and resources are limited and staff is tired, and now here's an additional document that you have to go through as you go through the surgical procedure. So he gave them the option of following the checklist or not, but they agreed, and they agreed to use the checklist for 3 months. What they saw as a result of that was really encouraging. The rate of major complications in all 8 hospitals collectively fell by 36%. The rate of deaths fell by almost half, 47%. And the need to return to the operating room after the initial surgery fell by 25%. So in those 8 hospitals, they estimated that they had saved 150 people from harm and 27 individuals from death with simply the addition of this checklist. All right, so this got the author motivated, and he wanted to find out where else are checklists used successfully. And he discovered that checklists are used not just in operating rooms, but widely used in medicine. Surprisingly, they're also used in financial management. Hedge fund or mutual fund managers and venture capitalists, both who use checklists, were identified as being undeniably more successful compared to their peers who did not use checklists. So this got Gawande pretty excited and recognized that checklists are not just a single thing or a thing for a single tool for a single industry, but they're used in very a wide variety of different industries. Now, by a show of hands, I guess what I'd like to ask right now is, how many of you use a checklist in any aspect of your life? Wow, that's awesome. That's like almost 100%. All right. We got that. The book concludes with the save. So this is a photograph of a laparoscopic operation. And I wish the projectors were just a little bit lighter, but has anyone here had laparoscopic surgery? Oh, wow, quite a few of you have. Okay, so rather than making an incision, they just have a little opening, a small incision, and then they put this remote control device in there. It usually has a light and a camera inside of it. And then the surgeons look at what the image is on the TV, and they can manipulate internally through these remote control devices, and it saves you from having a big zipper on your chest or your abdomen or whatever. So he's in the operating room. He's operating on a guy and removing a tumor from a gland laparoscopically. The team has been functioning well. As part of that process, they had a mistake where they nicked this guy's vena cava. The vena cava, and here's a little image that's going to come up. Your aorta takes oxygenated blood from the heart. Your vena cava, you actually have 2 of them. One's an upper, one's a lower. But that takes the deoxygenated blood from the various parts of your body to the heart, so the heart can pump it then through the aorta into your respiratory system and then out through the body. It's really big, a really big vein. They nicked this vena cava, and the patient lost most of their blood volume in about a half a minute. Because of that, they went into cardiac arrest, so they had to remove the laparoscopic instruments. They made an emergency incision, opened the guy's heart, or opened his chest and started manually massaging his heart, while the other team, or the other members of the team, scrambled to transfuse enough blood into him to keep him alive. The thing that saved his life, the patient's life, was that one item on the checklist was how much blood is typically lost in this operation, and what do we have on hand? Before the patient even came into the operating room, they ensured that they had a sufficient quantity of his blood type available. And that was enough to keep him alive while they repaired the damage and sewed him up. I think over the course of this operation, they transfused, I believe the author said, 3 times his normal blood amount into him, but saved his life. Interestingly, the author was a little resistant to use checklists in his own operating room. There's that ego again. It's like, I know how to do this. I'm under control. I'm cool. But his staff kind of badgered him and said, look, you've been researching and promoting checklists for quite a while, and if you don't use it, you're really going to damage your own credibility. In this particular operation, that checklist saved the life of this patient. So here's some time to reflect. We're not going to take as much time as I would have liked, but my question is to you that I'd like you to think about, which of your processes that you are responsible for do you consider are critical or very important? And which of those processes are multidisciplined, where you interact with other service providers, other functions in the HR world or outside of the HR world? Are there any processes that you manage that are complex, that are multi-stepped? And are they routine, or could they be routine? And if so, then for those processes, when have steps been missed or overlooked in the past? If you answer yes in your mind to any of those, then I would suggest that a checklist might help. Something as simple as a 3x5 card that helps a pilot taxi down a runway, take the plane, another 3x5 card that would allow them to land, taxi back into the hangar. Very simple things, but a tremendously powerful tool, which applied in the right situation could save somebody's life. It might save you from embarrassment. It might save one of your employees from maybe missing a paycheck. Who knows? All right, so your handout has examples of checklists, and just a couple, but that also, I'd like to point out, it has a checklist for checklists. So if you would like to incorporate a checklist not only in your professional life, but in your personal life, it will give you some guidance on how to create a checklist and implement it that will really do some wonderful things for you. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present. I've gone through this presentation just about as fast as I possibly could, trying to get us back on time. But I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have before we close this session. The silence is deafening. All right, thank you very much.